What do you believe right now that's making you feel this way? And when you analyse it, you realise how irrational you can be at times.
Every single one of our major customers and minor customers all shut their doors overnight.
It's not sales per se, but the outcome of it is, because people get to know you, they get to see you.
But, what's the culture like at the business? What do we stand for, the values?
I've got to tick that box on my personal development program I don't really want to be here.
Scaling up a business isn't easy. If it were, we wouldn't have less than 4% of businesses scaling beyond 10 employees or around £1 million turnover level, and less than 1% beyond 50 employees. But the contribution that we make as owner-managers to our economies is immense and should never be underestimated, yet it can be a tough gig for all of us at times, and only other business owners truly understand the challenges that we face. And through ScaleUp Radio, we aim to help make things a little easier. We interview guests who have been where you are now and may have faced some of the challenges that you are facing. And they offer their thoughts and advice on what has worked for them, as well as what didn't. And we've also combined many of the lessons from these interviews, and also through working with hundreds of owner managers over the last 10 years or so, into a practical scale-up handbook that we've called the Entrepreneurial Scale-Up System, or ESUS. And it's for owner managers like you and me as we navigate our own scale-up journey. And you can order a copy through your favourite online book retailer, or by going to all the W's, esusgroup.co.uk, www.esusgroup.co.uk. Welcome to this episode of ScaleUp Radio, and today I talk with Jonathan Harris, who is the head of growth at My Brightside, and we delve into Jonathan's entrepreneurial journey, scaling and selling his business that he founded with a couple of founders a while back, and his current role all the way through to that at Brightside. And we discuss recurring revenue, customer retention, transparency, the importance of transparency, and other key challenges of scaling up. And we talk about things like systemization, protecting intellectual property. There's a key part of the conversation around that because they were outsourcing their development of their software. And we also talk about the emotional roller coaster of selling a business. Jonathan's very open about how he felt when he sold his business. So we also look at valuing a tech company. We look at growth strategies, the importance of personal growth along the way. So join me with this fantastic conversation with Jonathan Harris on ScaleUp Radio. Welcome to another episode of ScaleUp Radio. I'm delighted today to have with me Jonathan Harris, who is the head of growth at Brightside. So Jonathan, welcome to ScaleUp Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin. It's been something I've been so looking forward to doing ever since we met a couple of months ago. I thought, right, we've got to get this going. So I do appreciate you carving out the time and having me on.
That's fantastic, and we had a great conversation. We met, as you say, at the awards ceremony at the Enterprising Worcestershire Awards, where you were with Coho, weren't you? And you actually won a couple of the big awards on the night.
We did, yeah. So we won the Growth Award, which was wonderful for me, being a growth specialist. I really enjoyed that one, and we also got, I think it was Business of the Year. I can't remember the exact title, but that was a real surprise. But actually, it was a wonderful event. There was a really exciting spread of businesses. And actually, I don't know if Worcestershire's always the first place that comes to mind when you think about innovative and exciting businesses. But actually, that event proved that notion wrong entirely. And it was a really fruitful day, and one that, it was thrilling to walk away with those awards. But actually, more so the relationships that were made that day and the connections that I've kept have been fab. So it was a wonderful event, and great to meet you and the team there as well.
Yeah, great. Absolutely concur with that. So, and things have changed for you since. So before you joined Coho, I think you set up and sold a business, and since Coho, you've now moved to Brightside by the sounds of it.
I have. So my background, I'll start, I suppose, at the beginning, when most good stories start. So I graduated in history and international politics. So on paper, I'm the least likely person to be an entrepreneur. I don't fit the profile of what it is to be a business owner, entrepreneur. But in many ways, my nature is to be a problem solver. I'm the sort of person who looks at situations, and I'm constantly asking myself, how can I improve that situation? How can I better it? How can I make it more efficient? And that led me into startup land, I suppose. That led me into meeting eventually who became my two business partners with my business Lead Hub. So I set that up in 2016, and that was a lead generation software product. And we focused predominantly on UK estate agents, and we worked with about 1,200 clients throughout the course of those 4 years. And we sold that November 2020. That was during the height of COVID. So I actually had the fortune really of being able to ride out most of COVID in relative comfort, that I'd sold the business. And I actually thought, this is a wonderful opportunity to spend some time with what was my young daughter. She was only 6 months old. Spend some time at home. We'd recently taken on a house to renovate. So I really enjoyed that. But actually, I started to get the itch to get back into the growth world and all the stuff that I love doing with my own business. I thought, right, I'm not going to found again for now. I'm sure at some point in the future I will set up my own business again. But what I thought is I'm in this position now to really find a business that I can align my values with, the sort of stuff that I want to get out of both my work and personal life. And I found Coho, and I had a chat with their CEO. I spoke about my background and what it is that I do, and teamed up with them, and we had a really successful time together. I've since moved on to another role as head of growth, but my time there was really sort of transformational for me. A huge amount about a new sector, a new industry, seeing the way that technology was evolving and the way that technology is being used across businesses to help them. And where they were at, it was helping businesses move from being, I suppose, person around the kitchen table startup to transitioning into a scale up and an established business that needed system, needed process in place in order to function at their very best. So that was great. And then we made a move over to Norfolk about 2.5 months ago. And in doing so, I started a new role, again as head of growth, but with My Brightside, who are Bristol-based, but they are at the very cutting edge of lead generation. B2B lead generation, but actually we internally and actually externally, frankly, refer to it as P2P, in that it's people
person,
person to person. And that's a fundamental pillar of the way that the business is designed. Frankly, everything that we do is always sense checked against the person to person pillar. So that's me. I hope that's given a sort of top level overview of where I'm at.
And that's given us a lot of possible directions for conversation. We've certainly got growth, which is obviously really important to all of us as entrepreneurs. So we can drill into growth a little bit. I'm also interested in your journey from starting a business with co-founders, scaling that, selling that, and then actually after, because that's something that isn't always talked about, is what, if a founder does manage to sell the business, what next?
Totally.
And we might even get around to talking around what sounded to me a little bit like that film. Is it called the money pit, with the house that just kept costing more and more money? It sounds like we were talking off air a little bit. So it sounds like you've got a house that reminds
me
a little bit.
Just a bit.
A little bit of that. So let's go back to Lead Hub and let's explore some of the lessons that you learned in starting, scaling, and then exiting that business. So what sort of size did you get the business to? You mentioned 12,000 estate agents on board with you. What sort of size was the business at that point when you sold?
So in terms of the number of people, we intentionally kept it as a very lean business by way of employees. We probably, if you counted everyone involved, there's probably about 12 of us. 6 of those were full-time. We then outsourced a lot of our development work to a dedicated agency called Momentum, Cheltenham-based agency. Do have a look at them; they're wonderful. But they supported us, and that was, from our perspective, a recognition that we didn't have all the answers nor the skill set required. And what we wanted to avoid doing was hiring an incredibly expensive internal development team until we'd really found our feet. So by outsourcing that part of the business, we were able to test the water, I suppose. But also what it did allow us to do is it allowed us to stay very regimented with our development schedule. And I think one of the biggest risks, I suppose, with early stage businesses is getting development distraction, in that you have your core product and your core offering. And as you start to get a few customers on board, as so does the customer feedback increase. And that can be wonderful, but it can also be quite damaging, because it starts to nudge you off track and leads you down to routes where you think, right, I've got to deliver this. But then what you can do there is just end up building a product for individual customers, rather than a business that is primed for a multi spectrum of customers and multi-touch. So that was an unintended consequence of using an outsourced dev team, that they kept us on very narrow sprints. We dedicated to a block of work over a period of, let's say, a month, and that was version 1. And then we took that away, we tested it, we got it battle ready. We did take feedback, but we didn't rush that feedback into the dev cycle. We then thought, right, how do we interpret this? Can we fix this outside of the product? Is this product integral? And so we grew that. So the team, as I said, about 12. We got it up to about £1 million a year annual turnover. So it was in a good position.
And that's
as a business.
That's recurring revenue. It's a license type model, I would imagine.
It was a recurring revenue model, and again, that was a real priority for us. One of our co-founders, he had been in a situation where he ran a successful business, but it was more project based, and actually there was a real appetite to find a model that hit that recurring revenue cycle. So we had a really good model from that respect. We also had a really good retention rate, and retention was a really important element of it. And I think the retention piece, funnily enough, probably gave rise to my interest in what it meant to be a growth specialist. There's always been a focus on selling and sales. And actually, as our business grew and as our business developed, a constant niggle of mine was how to make sure that actually that growth in terms of new customers wasn't offset by customers leaving out the other door. And so a huge amount of my emphasis and my role as the business grew was to join the dots across the entire business life cycle, I suppose, from customer acquisition and the cost and the process of doing that, right through to what it looked like, even if a customer did leave, how that relationship was managed. And that gave light, and I suppose gave fire to that growth speciality that I'm so passionate about.
Okay, good. So let's explore that a little bit. So what did you find? Did you find that there were particular points in the customer journey where maybe they were more likely to be at a considering leaving? What insights did you learn from that focus?
I think what I learned was that transparency is the number one most important thing. So I'll dig down into key moments in the year and budgetary considerations and all that. But what we found, that whether it was good news or bad news, transparency had to be at the forefront of that relationship. And when I say transparency, specifically with lead generation, that is about the amount of business that you're able to generate on behalf of that customer of yours. When it's going well, it's really easy to shout about it from the hilltops and to remind them of how well it's going. But when it's going badly, it's easy to bury your head in the sand and just hope that they don't notice. And that is something that I perhaps think we were guilty of in the early days as we were developing the product and the business. I think we were frightened to upset the apple cart. But actually, the companies that we worked with responded best when we identified a possible problem and provided a solution. And that's something that I think is so important for businesses, is to not be afraid of the challenge. Don't be afraid of having those uncomfortable conversations, because ultimately you do not want a business built on sand. You don't want a business built on going to bed at night thinking, oh gosh, I know that it's not quite performing as it should. How's that going to play out? You've got to control that narrative, whether it ultimately means that they do leave or whether they stay and they're far happier. That is a narrative that as a business owner, you have to take a hold of and control, because otherwise it starts to control you and it's not a healthy relationship.
Very good. Okay, excellent. So let's explore so you set up with a couple of other founders. So What lessons did you learn about setting a business up and scaling and exiting a business with co-founders? Because there's a lot of us out listening to this. Some of us are on our own. Some of us have got co-founders. What sort of things did you learn along the way?
Co-founders are a blessing and a curse. So co-founders, the beauty of co-founders is that you have somebody to sense check things against. It's really important that when you are selecting a co-founder, that they're selected for the right reasons. And I think the right reasons are people that really believe in what you're trying to do. Obviously, if you're filling a CTO role, there has to be that technical expertise. But really what you need to be doing is trying to build a team around you that shares, and I say shares your vision. I speak as if it's just one individual who's always the root cause of a company creation. Often, like was in my case, it was the convergence of 3 people, right place, right time, identified a niche, identified an opportunity, and just went after it, guns blazing. So I think it's important that you find people who share that passion. It's also a matter of luck. Not everyone's in a position to quit their day job, their 9 to 5, and set up and found a. So there's often a number of things that influence that. But I think that the most important thing in terms of managing those relationships is just ensuring throughout that you're always checking in with the other people and make sure that the commitment and the I suppose the intent is there, and that it's easy when a company it's in its early stages, and this is especially an early stage issue. When a company is in its very early infancy, it's very tempting to look elsewhere to plug that financial gap. You're thinking, right, we're not earning much money. I need a way to cover myself. But I think the danger there is that becomes a distraction. And actually starting any business requires unadulterated commitment and focus and attention. And so I think finding people who are lucky enough to be in that situation is a massive, massive bonus, and something that I'd encourage people to do if they are considering as solo founders bringing on a co-founder. Really understand what their situation is, what their appetite for being a bit lean for a period of time is, because that I think will really, really help. So I don't think I could go into a business without a co-founder. I think the way that I operate is I really enjoy that company, if nothing else, that ability to sense check, to validate, to celebrate, to commiserate. It's just having a bit like a partner in life. It's having somebody to do what will become an enormous part of your life with. So I think more so than not, it's a blessing. It's just one that has to be managed well, and a bit like managing client relationships, it has to be managed consistently throughout your time with them.
And how did you structure the business? Was it simply on a handshake and you sort of have a third each, or was it done a bit more formally than that?
It was a formal handshake in that we agreed to that structure. That structure from a very early stage was written into law as such. We all wanted to avoid a situation where there's any ambiguity and any he said, she said situations. So, all of us were, I suppose, protected from that respect. And everyone, I say everyone, that's a massive assumption, but most business owners have that intention of an exit. And actually that was always the intention for Lito. Okay. We always wanted to sell it. It was never going to be a lifelong thing. It was a product that really hit a niche, but actually, even as we scaled the business, there were a number of competitors and incumbents coming through. Okay. And so we knew that it was a business that we were priming for sale. So actually getting those structures in place was important and really is important. And actually, I've, speaking from sort of other experience, and this is secondary experience, but I've seen situations where people have done that structuring almost too early, in that they've had a team of, let's say, 3 or 4 founders. They've designated shares, they've given each other 25%, and then 6 months in, one of the founders has decided actually it's not for them, they're going to move. And because the business wasn't structured correctly, they have maintained that 25% shareholding. Yeah. And that is something that is really important to avoid. So one thing I consider is actually how can a sort of founder team ensure that anyone that remains behind is best protected, and actually the person who leaves doesn't overly benefit, unnecessarily benefit, I suppose, from that. So that can be clauses such as writing in, the sort of company shares only being valid after X amount of time lapsed, or certain milestone hit financially, and it's not a comfortable conversation to have, because you don't want to ever assume that the person you're going into business with might possibly screw you over or decide to take a different route. But these things happen, and it's really important to be aware of that in the early stages, and make sure that it's done properly, and it's done with all the considerations, all the possible exit points, whether that's a sale or a business being dissolved or diluted, whatever it is. Consider those things. Very pragmatic.
Yeah, excellent advice. Great. So what did you learn about the scaling up? What were some of the high points and the low points in your 4-year journey then of scaling up before exit?
Yeah, so that transition between starting up and scaling up, I think what I learned most was having to let go. And when I say that, I think, in the early stages, I was the baker, the candlestick maker, whatever the expression is. I did absolutely everything, and I felt incredibly precious over all the different elements of my business. And as a result, I think a lot of the processes were more manual than they needed to be. So as we sort of moved ourselves into a scale up, more established business, I suppose, a lot of my my challenge and my own teething issue was letting go of certain parts of the business and trusting key hires with running those, trusting that I was employing people who knew more than I did. I'm not afraid to admit that I don't know everything. I'm far from knowing everything. And actually, I've always maintained that, hire people who are better than you where possible. Hire people who can bring something to the table. I think some people are fearful of hiring people that they see as being too senior or too advanced. I don't know if it's an egotistical thing. I don't know what it is, but I know people who shy away from doing so. But so letting go of parts of the business, I think, is a challenge for anyone moving from startup to scale up. But I also think that ensuring that you have really correct systems and structures in place to allow you to scale. The question we always ask the chap who is responsible for our development and a lot of these sort of internal stuff was, what happens if he, now this is very morbid, but what happens if he gets hit by a bus? Yes. What happens if, what happens to the IP? What happens to our business knowledge? What happens to our structure if all of the information is held in our noggins, in our brain? That isn't a sustainable method of growing and scaling a business. So moving everything out of our heads and out of our hearts, I suppose, is what allowed us to transition from being a sort of kitchen table startup to a more established business, by getting information down and getting information palatable and absorbable, if that's a word, by those coming into the team. That would be my big advice about that.
And practically, how did you do that? Are we talking about some great big CRM or knowledge base, or what are we
combination combination of the two. So we ran everything through HubSpot as a CRM. We made sure that all of the customer knowledge was there, so that anyone could pick up on a customer profile or a customer file and find out all the information there. We also ensured that by outsourcing a lot of the development work to Momentum, who are our development partners, we had that spread of knowledge. We had a whole team there of people who were in constant control of the data upload, the data cleansing, all the processes that were in place. We then had our internal knowledge banks. We did a lot of recording. It was the predecessor to Loom. I don't know if you know Loom, but Loom is where you can record stuff and have a little. So we used a system, I forget what it's called now, but a system before Loom came about to record as much of our knowledge as possible to get it down. And then when new hires came in, that was part of the induction. It was getting them familiar with the Momentum, the dev team, getting them familiar with our processes, and then trying where possible to stay to our lane. So appreciating what each part of the business was good at, and trying to keep people within that lane, obviously given the opportunity to grow and develop, but really saying what you need to focus on is that route. And so that really is a very long-winded way of saying that actually it's about system, it's about process, it's about systemization. And there's a real difference between, scaling and really, putting systems in place to scale, and just selling and growing. Scaling is its own challenge in itself.
Yeah, good. And something that you mentioned in passing, almost in a way, you're outsourcing your development through Momentum, and of course your IP, what you're building up as your really valuable asset in the business, of course, is the software itself. So how did you make sure you're protected with the fact that you're outsourcing that and somebody else is developing that code and has the code? How did you make sure that IP was actually belonging to you, and in a way that, regardless of what happened with Momentum, that you still had that?
It's a really, really good question. So actually, I'll skip forward to an experience that I went through myself in between selling the business and starting Coho before I moved back. So in between doing those two things, I set about launching a referral platform. It was called Della, and I invested a lot of money into that, and ultimately got burnt by the chap that I employed to do it. I found a freelance developer and employed him on an 8-week contract, and 8.5 months later I had nothing to show for it. And I'd invested the best part of £30,000 into the project. I'd given up effectively a year of my life waiting and trying to manage that relationship through. And that was the very worst case scenario as to what can happen with outsourcing teams, in that you are entrusting not just your IP and your business idea, you're trusting your life in many ways. And when I say that, I don't mean your actual life, but you're giving over that time and you're entrusting them with a project that could shape the next decade of your life.
Yes.
And that relationship has to be really, really well handled. And I was lucky with LeadHub in that Momentum were actually a group of people I went to school with. There's real trust and real, togetherness there. So I trusted them. But actually, going back to the whole co-founder conversation we had previously, we had to ensure that all the information remained ours, that all the IP was very much ours, that all information was held on shared servers that we always maintained access to, that we controlled those key parts of the journey. So that if they got incapacitated, that we could, at the flick of a button, move that information across. And that was as much as, for a non-technical founder, understanding and making sure we had a total log of the sort of language that they built in, whether it was Ruby on Rails or whatever what the other languages are, ensuring that actually we had a backup plan. So a lot of what our system did was data harvesting, which is a polite word for scraping, but it was ensuring that actually for every system in place, there was an alarm as to when something went wrong. So if the data harvesting fell over, if it stopped working, we needed to ensure that we were alerted to that, and we had a backup contingency and something else in place. So there was a lot of that in place, a lot of checks and a lot of process. But ultimately, we ensured that any contract we ever signed, we maintained total ownership. So when it did come to sell, there was no issue over who owned what. We owned the IP, we owned the data, we owned the client base. That was all ours. They'd simply be contracted, and they just handed over all of the code. It was just transferred to the company who bought us to them, and we handled the fluffier stuff, the clients and client details and stuff. But yeah, ensuring that these things are properly set up from the outset, and again, checked. Don't believe as a founder that you know everything. Always try and get this stuff sense checked. It might be expensive at the outset, but always run contracts through a lawyer or contracts through somebody that you implicitly trust on a legal side, because these things are very difficult to unpick, as I discovered very much to my own loss a couple of years later. Do make sure that you get sense check and you don't believe your own hype and your own spin. Acknowledge your own limitations and get help where it's available. Good.
More very, very sound advice. Okay, so let's move on to the exit, to the whole sale process? What surprised you about that? What did you learn about going through that process?
I think it will come as no surprise that it's incredibly stressful.
Yeah.
It's not an enjoyable process in the slightest, and I think a lot of that is down to things like due diligence. You settle on a sort of a pre-agreed price, but like selling a house, there's the sale price, and the due diligence process will inevitably bring up stuff that alters that and has an impact on that. And the nature of what we did, we were bought by a competitor, and they ran a very similar business to us at the time, so they understood what we did. But the nature of everything meant that we just had to make sure that all of our ducks were in a row. And again, that's another bit of advice for people starting up. From day one, make sure your books are in record, make sure everything is kept as tickety-boo and as layman's as possible in many ways. Make sure you have structure and filing and all the good business practice that's sometimes easy to overlook in the excitement of a startup.
Yeah.
Get those boring things in place.
Yeah.
So it's very, very stressful. But actually, at the conclusion of the sale, I think one thing that really struck me is I was expecting this moment of euphoria and total release, which never came.
Right.
In all honesty, it never came. It happened. We'd got notification through solicitors that the business had, successfully been transferred, and I think I had a bit of a adrenaline, emotional, some sort of come down. I didn't go up. I came down, which is really odd. And I've tried to unpack that in the years since, and I think a lot of it was because it was a stressful period, and I was also letting go of something that I'd built up over 4 years. And actually the people I've been working with for a few years before that as well. So it was a big chunk of my life, and I didn't have clarity on what I was going to do next. My entire focus had been on the exit, and I'd not given thought to what happens then. I sold it at the age of 31, I think I was at the time, 30 or 31. So I had hopefully a big life ahead of me, a long life ahead of me. And so it happened, and I was a bit flat, which I know is probably not what your listeners want to hear, but there wasn't that moment of euphoria. And the money's cleared and everything. I was like, this is wonderful. But actually, life goes on, and I think understanding that and trying to work out what life looks like post exit is really important. And it's something that I was so guilty of giving no thought to whatsoever. I absolutely just didn't consider life afterwards. But I think my advice to anyone listening is, if you are gearing up for an exit, consider why. Why is it you want to exit? Is it because, what is it? And if it's a financial thing, how are you going to use that money? What are you going to put that money towards? If it's simply because you want to move on to new things, again, what do those new things look like? So work towards that exit, but actually life after exit is can be quite mundane. You suddenly lose something that you've been giving every waking hour to, and you suddenly come off that incredibly fast moving roller coaster. And I had moments where I questioned my identity, and I suddenly had a bit of a self crisis. I was thinking, gosh, great, I've got this notch on my belt, and that I'm an exited founder. Wonderful. The world tells you that is the gold standard of business, and it's wonderful. Like it really has changed my life. It was a good sum that we sold it for. It wasn't life changing, but it changed my life, in that it's allowed me to really pick up on work and projects that I now feel passionate about. And for me, that is the biggest blessing and the biggest win from that, is that I don't any longer have to answer to the man as such. I can decide what I want to do, and that goes beyond sort of business. That filters down into my personal life. I now try and really focus on my kids. I make sure I'm always there for bath time and bedtime and all that stuff that really matters to me as a dad and a parent. It's given me, selling business, I suppose, has given me that, both financially and also from a positional point of view. It gives you a certain status, which sounds very arrogant. I don't mean it as an arrogance, but it gives you a certain level that you're able to then decide where to operate from.
And in a confidence, I'm sure, and self-belief from that
It
aspect as well.
does, and yeah, it sort of makes you think. We started the business with £500, and to be able to take something and I think that also really pleased my inner problem solver that we discussed at the very beginning. I really like to take situations and understand them and work out how to best utilize them, to best make them efficient. And so I think a lot of those boxes were ticked. And so yeah, it was a massive confidence boost, and it's been wonderful for my career since. But at the same time, it does present you with a series of unexpected challenges in that you do question what life now looks like.
Yes, and I think you mentioned that feeling, and part of the reason I asked is I've heard it lots of times before from founders. The day after the money's hit the bank, sort of thing. It's like, well, okay, now what? And as you say, if you haven't worked out what it is you want to do next, you want the pull factor to be almost as big as the push factor. Want to push and want to sell, but because we want to exit, but actually we want the pull of something else to be equally as strong, so that we've got that. So I think that sense of identity that we all have with our businesses, if that's taken away, if we haven't got anything else to replace it with, that leaves that hole. So yeah,
it's really a huge void.
Yeah, really good for you to share that with us. I'm curious as well, going back to you say a competitor bought you. Is that how did the conversation start? Did you go to market, as it were, or did that relationship happen some other way?
So they were a very friendly competitor, in that at the very early stages of both of our businesses setting up, we both operated on an area exclusive basis. So we said, right, we could only, so it was split by UK postcodes. So we said, for example, we could only operate with one client per postcode, GL53. And they had the same model. So actually there was a lot of client transfer at the very early stages, where we said we can't serve you, but actually go over to them. Yeah. And likewise, it came back. But actually, when it came to selling, they weren't the first port of call. We had a couple of very quiet conversations. We started just having conversations with people that we'd identified as being possible fits. So these were big organizations who could then offer the software down to their network. And the first few conversations went absolutely nowhere. They just wasn't of interest. And word got out. It was a real great thing for us. It was a real perk. But actually, word got out, and we were approached by the company who ultimately bought us, and they approached us. So it was a very very difficult process to try and recreate. I don't think anyone who goes to exit can necessarily take what we did as a blueprint, but you've got to find that balance between you've got to at some stage let people know that you're in the market for selling. You'll never sell a business if nobody knows you're trying to sell it. That's fact. But at the same time, you've got to manage that knowledge without people abusing it and interpreting it in the wrong way. I think you've got to do that from a position, as much as possible, from a position of strength, depending on the situation. You've got to position it as a real opportunity for whoever might be buying it. And the whole narrative around that has got to be quite tightly controlled, because otherwise, you don't want people thinking you're doing a distressed sale or whatever. Again, there's a lot of housing analogies there. But we just started having quiet conversations with key contacts in the industry, and word got out that we were considering, and actually it perhaps happened sooner than we'd anticipated. One thing that we were impacted by, the housing market was really hit by COVID. Initially the housing market just shut off. It literally they pulled the rug from under its feet. And that had an impact on the business, in the first sort of 6 months of COVID. But actually, luckily, the housing market was the one part of the economy that then was kickstarted. So that was a wild roundabout ride. And that was all happening whilst these conversations were happening. So, I go back to the stress of everything happening. When you get hit with a global pandemic, business sell conversation, it adds an element of complication. But again, I think we were at an advantage in that the person buying us, the business buying us, was in exactly the same situation. They understood the model, they understood everything. So I think when it comes to identifying that exit, you know, some people will use a broker. I think brokers are a really useful asset in that regards, because they can have those very quiet conversations with either high net individuals or people that they know in that space. And so I think we were lucky. I'm not ashamed to say that. I think life does require sprinkles of luck.
Yes.
And I think we were lucky ultimately to get to where we got to at a moment in time during COVID that we got to. So that's how it all panned out.
And did you have a sense of what the company was worth?
Yes and no. So again, that's a real challenge to anyone listening when you're valuing a tech company. It's a real challenge to know. And again, especially tech values have gone through the floor really recently. You know, basically for every percentage point interest rates increase, the attractiveness of a startup from an investment perspective probably drops by 10% at least. So you know, we were in a moment in time where tech values were still high. They were often based around, you know, revenue multiples, and we were very comfortably in profit, which was great. I think that's something that businesses in today's world have got to put more emphasis on. I think there's been a sort of sleepwalking stage over the last decade or so where there's been a massive focus on customer acquisition at the costs of everything else. Yeah. And as the world gets a little bit more fragile, I think there's going to be a real, well, we're already seeing it, but a real shift towards revenue as being the number one marker of a business performance. And so my sort of advice as we're discussing this would be to do everything you can as a business to figure out that revenue model, prove that revenue model, and start to get that on the right track. You don't need to be at the sort of golden point that you think you need to be at, but actually proving revenue and market fit as early as possible is really, really key. So yeah, going back to us, it was difficult. You know, we sought some advice at the time. You know, we knew a few people in the sort of tech space, I suppose, who were able to offer sort of rough guidance. But things came into it. The value of the IP, the value of the client base, the value of the contracts in place. One thing that was quite tricky for us to value was we had a no contract business. So we had a monthly rolling contract with our customers. Okay. That adds a level of complication. So again, if you're in a position where you have contracts, it's a very attractive pitch for new business when you say we don't have contracts. But from an exit perspective, it's something I would considering in that how can we have as few barriers to entry whilst protecting our exit is something to consider. So a value was arrived at through a number of different methods. But you know, having, again, I touched on what I said earlier, having your ducks in a row influences that. You know, having all the stuff, there's the top level value, like with any product, but making sure that everything falls into place beneath that is as vital. And I think one thing to also consider is the cost of selling isn't insignificant. You know, you've got lawyers, you've got accountants, there's a lot of different things at play there, which I naively hadn't fully considered at the time. But there is a lot of cost of business sale. Luckily, and I don't know if it's still in play, but at the time we were able to take advantage of the entrepreneur's relief, which meant that we just taxed at 10%. And so that was a real win. So again, business structure matters. Getting those things in place matters. Making sure everything is kosher affects the value of the sale, but also the value of what you as an individual can walk away with after the tax man's come knocking. So yeah.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you very much for those insights. And now you're very much, and this, you know, this, you were saying that this has been a key part of all of your journey, but from the growth aspect now, that's what you're in. So what do we need to think about from business owners then as from a growth perspective?
Yeah, so I think, and I started my role with Coho when I first started. I popped on LinkedIn. You know, I've started a new role as head of growth, and somebody messaged me, sort of, I suppose, kicking me in the ribs, giving me a bit of jip about the job title, and said, "Isn't that just head of sales?" And I said, actually, it's not. It is so different from a sales role in that growth happens across the entire business function. Growth is obviously influenced by selling, but growth is also influenced by your ability to retain customers. And retaining customers comes down to how well your product is performing, how well your product is keeping in line with customer requirements, how well your product is performing against any incumbents or competitors. And so understanding your entire business cycle, but also the wider business world, your competitors, what's happening in the economy, all these things have the potential to influence both positively and negatively growth. So I suppose my interests, and I touched on being able to pursue those passions post-sale, my interest has really fallen on how can I influence a company's growth and their stability. Obviously, getting the stability bit right is the first bit, but nobody wants a head of stability in their company. You've got to get the foundations secured. And I really try and move people away from putting too heavy a focus on just pulling people through in the entry door and disregarding what it looks like for people to exit. Because actually, I think if a customer does actually want to leave, I think the way that a customer is handled on leaving is more important than how they're handled coming into the business. Both hold precedent, but actually the way that you treat people at that moment in time is what will set your reputation and your legacy. And it's easy to be excited and to be, engaged at the point of closing an exciting contract, but actually you'll be remembered for how people leave. And so that's something I've really tried to understand. Obviously, I hate it when people leave a business, but really managing that entire flow of relationship is something that I now, as a growth specialist, really try and instill into businesses and get right and move away from a very old-fashioned notion of sell at the cost of everything else.
Very good. Yeah, excellent. Wise words indeed. Right. We've taken us on a really, really great journey, right the way through with Lead Hub, through Coho, and now into My Brightside. So are you right for a couple of quick fire questions as we round up? Of
course, yeah. As you come into land, of course, please do, Kevin.
Yeah, it's a time's flown already. So if you could go back to your younger self, what advice would you give to yourself?
If I could go back to my younger self, it's a good question. I think what I would say to my younger self is don't focus on what you want to be, which is what the world tells you to do. You're at school and everyone's saying what you want to be. You're going to be a teacher, a lawyer, a surgeon. Mm-hmm. Try and move away from focusing on what you want to be and focus on who you want to be as a person, as a human, as an individual. Who do you want to be? What do you want to be known for? What are your interests? What are your passions? What are the things that set you alight? Because you'll find that as you go through life, there is a business connection to those things. If you're naturally inquisitive, there's likely going to be a place for you in entrepreneurship. If you're very structured and regimented, there's always ways to work these things out. And I think for many people, the biggest challenge is that first job out of university, is that first step into the working world. But I think once you've done that, it becomes easier. But I think there's too much focus on young people. There's too much focus on what you want to be. And that's an impossible question to answer as a 15-year-old even. Yes. You don't know. All that you know is your immediate nucleus of influence. Because your parents might be certain things or your friends' parents might be certain things. But your experience of the world is limited to an incredibly narrow view of what's possible. So something I would teach myself and something I'm really trying to teach my children as they grow is to put an enormous amount of energy on focusing on the sort of person they want to be, and become people of passion, become people of interest. I think interested people become interesting. If you have the ability to dig into topics and to master those elements of life that excite you. So I studied history and international politics, and I've maintained a massive interest in both those topics. And a lot of people see it as being very nerdy, but actually I really value that, and I really value being able to dedicate myself to something outside of work. And so yeah, it's a very long-rooted answer, but I think putting emphasis on that is something that I wish I'd been told. I really struggled when I was younger with the "what do you want to be" question, because I had no idea, and I didn't know where to go to look for the answers. And if I'd perhaps given more focus to what I think were natural skill sets I've really been able to draw on since, being in the working world, public speaking and sort of persuasive writing, all that stuff, all those skills, I wish I'd given more precedent to and understood their value as a younger child, younger adult.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So you're definitely, I'm sure you're a reader and a learner. So are there any books or podcasts or resources that you would point other entrepreneurs to?
Yes. So actually what I'd encourage everyone to do is split your reading out into fiction and nonfiction. I think it's really important to have escapism in the world, and I read some absolute trash. I'll tell you now, but I use it as a way of escaping. I'm not a huge TV watcher. I don't spend a lot of time reading TV. I tend to prefer being outside and doing stuff in the garden, whatever. But when I read, I try and break down my reading between stuff that helps me escape, stuff that is so far removed from reality that actually I get transported into a world. But then on the flip side, I read a lot of books about things like geopolitics and really meaty stuff that my wife just rolls her eyes at. Stuff that I find, I was brought up in Kenya, in East Africa. And so I read a lot of books focused around, the state of Africa in that what's influenced Africa as it is today, and the impact that colonialism and small things like how the countries were divided out has impacted a number of things. So that stuff takes me interest. But from a podcast perspective, and these are perhaps cliche ones, but I listened to the Stephen Bartlett podcast, Diary of a CEO, and also the High Performance podcast, which is I think Jake Humphreys who runs that. And also I listen to a lot of stuff that Michelle Obama does. I find Michelle Obama perhaps one of the most inspiring people that I've ever read or listened to, because I think what she does, and perhaps she just speaks into the place that I'm at in my life at the moment as a parent of young children. And she has a wonderful ability to break down the complexities of working and parenting and managing, high pressure relationships. So across those three, I get a really good feel. I then listen to a few crime podcasts and a few other bits and bobs. But in terms of business learning, I think there's a lot to be taken from people who sort of are able to speak outside the box and who've been there and done it, but also speak often an alternative narrative. I think that's really important, to challenge your thinking, to think, accepting that you don't know everything. Frankly, you don't know a decimal of what there is to know. I think the more that people accept that, the more empowering it is, I believe. The more that thirst for knowledge kicks in, and it's a never-ending journey. I never want to stop learning. I never want to stop absorbing information and doing stuff with it, and that really drives me. A thirst for knowledge is something that really motivates me, I suppose, much to my wife's disdain.
Very good. And you mentioned Michelle Obama. One of my next questions was who's had the most influence on you as a business leader, or who do you look up to?
Most influence as a business leader. That is a really, really good question. I'd put me on the spot there, Kevin. I think I would probably say Michelle Obama. Whilst typically she's often seen as being second fiddle to Barack, I think the way that she has taken life post the White House, I really aspire to. I aspire to the way that she blends empathy with action and all those things that I really value. And there's a lot of talk around the markers of success, and for me especially, success for me at least, isn't just a financial marker. Success is the ability to control my time more and control what I do with my life and all those things that play into it. So amongst many others, I'd say at the moment, I think Michelle Obama ranks really, really highly on the people who've, I suppose, influenced what I do. There's all those big CEOs you look at of the multi corporations and you see sound bites and all that, but actually it's not very relatable. I think that the best learning takes from being relatable. I think that's why Michael McIntyre is so funny, because his humor is observational. He really taps into humanity. So I think empathetic leaders is where I tend to pin my flag in terms of my inspiration and development.
Very good. Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation.
So have I. It's been wonderful. I don't know what the time is, but
yes, we're just about there. So if people would like to get hold of you, Jonathan, either directly or find out more about My Brightside, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so a couple of ways. You can find me on LinkedIn. I don't know if you can include links to this podcast or not, Kevin, but I'm just Jonathan Harris. I've got a photo of me pointing up at my title image there. So connect with me there. You can have a look at My Brightside. So, Kevin, you've touched on it. We are business-to-business lead generators. We work with an amazing variety of customers. You wouldn't believe the variety and the scope of customers we work with. But you could do that. You can get me on my email address, which again I'll provide details of. But really, I'll just anyone who wants to chat things growth. If you want to have a conversation about the growth challenges, growth opportunities, that is what lights my fire, and I really like bringing people along on that journey. So do connect with me on LinkedIn. My email is just my name, jonathan.harris@mybrightside.co.uk. But again, you'll have that information afterwards. But I'd love to connect.
And Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for being my guest on ScaleUp Radio.
Kevin, I so appreciate your time. I'm not looking forward to hearing my own voice back, but looking forward to hearing the contents of this podcast. So I do appreciate your time.
I hope you enjoyed that discussion, and if you're building and scaling your own business, you might well be interested in our book, The Entrepreneurial Scale-Up System. And it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a practical handbook around scaling a business in a structured way. And you can order a copy on all your favorite online retailers, including an audio version, or you can find it and other supporting resources on our website, www.esusgroup.co.uk. That's esusgroup.co.uk, which is esusgroup.co.uk.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.